My wife Evelyn lived two lives. One with me, Richard Vance, a retired history teacher in a small, quiet house in Chicago. The other a secret life where she built a $48 million fortune. When she died, I inherited both. My son Dan only cared about the second. The day we learned the truth, he demanded I hand it all over. I refused. So he locked me out of the home. We had shared the home where I raised him. He thought he had made me a beggar, left me shivering on the street. But my wife was always 3 moves ahead. She left me a key. A key to a fortress he never knew existed. When he finally came to claim that fortress, he found me on the doorstep, not alone. He froze, staring at the person standing beside me, and in that moment, he must have realized. My wife's ghost had just checkmated him. It all started in a glass tower that scraped the gray Chicago sky. A week after we buried Evelyn, her lawyer, Mr. Albright, had called me in for a final reading. Dan came with me, playing the part of the supportive son. The office was a world of polished mahogany and the quiet scent of old leather, a world Evelyn had apparently moved through without me ever knowing. I sat on a chair that cost more than my first car, feeling the worn fabric of my funeral suit, and waited to sign papers for her modest pension. Mr. Albright adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. His gaze was kind, but heavy with a truth I wasn't prepared for. "Richard," he said, his voice steady, "Evelyn's affairs were extensive. She created a blind trust 3 decades ago. You are its sole beneficiary." He pushed a thick leather-bound binder across the table. "As of this morning, the trust is valued at $48,200,000. The number hung in the air, an impossible weight. My mind couldn't grasp it. Evelyn, my Evelyn, who debated buying name-brand coffee, who patched the elbows on my favorite sweater, who loved the simple quiet of our life. It wasn't possible." I looked at Dan. His jaw was slack, his usually restless leg perfectly still. The air left his lungs in a short, sharp gasp. "There's a mistake," I said, my voice thin. "No mistake," Albright assured me. He explained that Evelyn was a pioneering software architect in the early days of tech. She'd sold patents, invested wisely, and built a silent empire, all while living a life of quiet simplicity with me. He then slid a single heavy brass key across the desk. "She also left you a property. It's held by the trust completely off the public record. A place in Wisconsin. She called it Sanctuary." Dan's eyes snapped from the binder to the key. He wasn't seeing a grieving husband or a memento of a secret life. He was seeing an asset, a complication. The silence in his luxury car on the way home was a living thing. The scent of new leather felt like a gag. I turned the heavy key over and over in my hand, the cold metal, the only thing that felt real. Dan broke the silence, his voice a smooth, practiced balm of concern. "Dad, we need to be smart about this. A fortune that size. It needs professional management." "My management." I looked out at the blur of the city. "Evelyn wanted me to have it." "And you will," he said quickly, a little too quickly. "But we need to protect it, for the family. We'll set up a new trust, something more efficient. I'll handle the investments, the legal. You won't have to worry about a thing." He was already using words like "we" and "our." The 48 million had already become his in his mind. I was just the temporary, inconvenient guardian. "I need time, Dan," I said. "Time is what we don't have," he countered, a new edge to his voice. "The market is volatile. We need to move the assets before—" He trailed off, but I could finish the sentence. Before I did something he couldn't control. For 42 years, my world had been shaped around the word yes for him. "Yes, you can have the car. Yes, I'll co-sign the loan. Yes, of course we'll help with the down payment. The no was small, but it felt like shifting the foundation of a house. No, Dan. Not until I understand what your mother truly wanted. He didn't speak for the rest of the drive. The muscles in his jaw were knots of steel. When we got back to my small brick house, Brenda was there. She descended upon me with a hug that felt like an appraisal, her sharp eyes scanning my face. Richard. What a shock, but a wonderful one. We are all so blessed. She and Dan moved like a well-rehearsed team. They sat me down in my own armchair, while they stood a united front. Richard, let's be realistic. Brenda began, her voice sharp as glass. What are you going to do with all that money? Fund a library? Dan's real estate venture is on the verge of a major expansion. This is the capital he needs. It's a chance to build a true Vance family legacy, a legacy built on my inheritance, on Evelyn's life's work. It's my decision, I said, my voice gaining a strength I hadn't realized was there. And I need time. Dan's patience finally snapped. He loomed over me, his shadow falling across my chair. We don't have time for your sentimentality, Dad. This is business. This is our future. You either sign the control over to me or we will be forced to take legal measures. We'll have you declared incompetent to manage your own affairs. A judge will see that we're just trying to protect you. The cruelty of it stole my breath. To use my grief as a weapon to paint their greed as concern. I felt a lifetime of quiet sacrifices curdle in my stomach. I stood up, feeling every one of my 68 years. I need to walk. I left them there in my home, their faces a mask of righteous frustration. I walked the familiar streets of my neighborhood, the wind whipping at my coat. I walked until the sun began to set, until the chill sank deep into my bones. I thought they would have left. I thought they would have had the decency to let me grieve in peace. When I returned, the house was dark. I reached for my key, my hand trembling slightly. I slid it into the lock. It didn't turn. It stopped with a solid, dead thud of metal hitting metal. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried again. Nothing. They had changed the lock. I pounded on the door, the sound echoing in the empty street. Dan opened the door. His voice came through the thick wood, cold and final. I'm sorry, Dad. It's for your own good. We can't let you throw everything away. We'll talk when you're ready to be reasonable. I heard the chain slide across, locking me out for good. I stood on the cold concrete of my own porch, the man of the house now a trespasser. They had taken my home. They had taken my past. They thought they had taken my future. I sank down onto the steps, the night air closing in around me. They saw a broken old man alone and defeated. They had no idea I was holding a key in my pocket. They had no idea he was looking at the warden of a fortress he was about to storm. A fortress my wife had built for exactly this moment. The cold from the concrete steps seeped into my bones, a deep, invasive chill that had nothing to do with the November wind. I sat there for a long time, the man of the house now a beggar on his own porch. My son's words echoed cold and final. It's for your own good. The world I knew, the one built on 40 years of quiet love and shared sacrifices, had been bulldozed in a single afternoon. Despair was a heavy coat, and I was ready to pull it over my head. But then my fingers, numb inside my pocket, brushed against the key. The heavy brass key Mr. Albright had given me. Sanctuary. A safe harbor. And I remembered the lawyer's last words spoken with an urgency I hadn't understood at the time. If anything happens, anything at all, you call this number. Don't call the police. Don't call your son. Call this number. My hand trembled as I pulled out my phone. The screen was painfully bright in the darkness. I dialed the number from the small card Albright had slipped into my coat pocket. It rang twice, a clean electronic sound that cut through the night. A man's voice answered, calm and steady with no preamble. Thorne. My name is Richard Vance, I began, my voice hoarse. Mr. Albright gave me your number. My son. He's locked me out of my house. There was no surprise in the man's voice. No pity. Just a quiet efficiency. I understand, Mr. Vance. What is your location? I gave him the address. Stay where you are. I will be there in 20 minutes. A black SUV. Do not speak to anyone else. The line clicked dead. 20 minutes felt like a lifetime. I watched the cars of my neighbors pull into their driveways, warm squares of light opening and closing as families went inside for the night. I was a ghost watching a life I no longer had. Then exactly 19 minutes later, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled silently to the curb. It had no logos, no markings, just the quiet hum of a powerful engine. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, built like a man who had spent his life carrying weight, with short, graying hair and eyes that saw everything. He walked up the path to my porch with a steady, unhurried gait. This was Thorne. Mr. Vance, he said, his voice the same calm baritone from the phone. He looked at the locked door, then back at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Mrs. Vance prepared for this years ago. Please come with me. He didn't offer to help me up, and I was grateful for that. He treated me not as a victim, but as a man with a destination. I followed him to the idling vehicle. As I slid into the warm leather of the passenger seat, I looked back at my little brick house one last time. It looked smaller now, a cage I had just escaped. We didn't drive to a hotel. We drove out of the city toward the smaller private airfields that catered to corporate jets and wealthy hobbyists. The city lights fell away behind us, replaced by the dark, sleeping shapes of the countryside. Thorne didn't speak much, and his silence was a comfort. It was the silence of a professional, a man following a set of instructions left by someone he respected. We pulled up to a hangar where a sleek, small jet waited, its lights cutting through the darkness. We're flying? I asked, my voice still sounding foreign to my own ears. Yes, sir. To Sanctuary, Thorne replied. He opened the rear door of the SUV and lifted out a handsome wooden box with brass fittings. It looked like something you would keep old maps or heirlooms in. He held it out to me. Evelyn asked me to give this to you, but only at this exact moment, when you were on your way to the place she built for you. I took the box. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a single thick envelope sealed with wax. My name was written on the front, in Evelyn's elegant, familiar script. It was a letter from a ghost. A letter from my wife reaching out to guide me through a war I never knew she had seen coming. The jet was a small, quiet world of its own cutting through the black sky. I sat in a leather seat that felt too soft, the wooden box resting on my lap. Below us, the lights of Chicago receded, becoming a glittering web, then a faint memory. My whole life was down there. A life that now felt like a story someone else had written. My fingers traced the wax seal on the envelope. It was shaped like an oak leaf, a small private symbol between Evelyn and me. I broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, creamy, and covered in her familiar, precise handwriting. My dearest Richard, it began. If you are reading this, then the part of our son, that I feared most, has finally shown itself. I am so sorry. Sorry that I am not there to stand with you, and sorry for the secrets I had to keep to protect you. The plane banked, and the engines changed their pitch. Thorn sat across from me, a silent, steady presence. He wasn't watching me. He was watching the horizon as if on guard. We landed on a small private airstrip in Wisconsin, a single ribbon of asphalt carved out of a dense forest. There was no terminal, no tower, just a waiting SUV identical to the one that had picked me up. The air was different here, clean, sharp, and smelling of pine and cold earth. We drove for another 30 minutes, leaving the main road for a smaller one, then a smaller one still, until we were on a gravel lane that seemed to be swallowed by the woods. Finally, a gate appeared. Not wrought iron and ostentatious, but solid steel and stone blending seamlessly with the landscape. It slid open without a sound. The letter continued in my mind. Dan is not the man we raised. He is driven by a hunger that will never be satisfied, and Brenda feeds it. They see you as a relic, a sentimental old man standing between them and what they believe they are owed. I could not bear the thought of them leaving you with nothing. We rounded a final bend, and I saw it. Sanctuary. It wasn't a house. It was a statement. A long, low structure of dark cedar local stone and vast panes of glass that reflected the surrounding forest. It was modern, but it felt ancient, as if it had grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. It was a fortress disguised as a work of art. Thorn parked the car and led me to the front door, a massive slab of wood that opened with the soft click of a high-end vault. The lights inside came on, not with a switch, but with our presence, a soft, warm glow that illuminated a breathtaking space. A great room with a ceiling 2 stories high, dominated by a stone fireplace big enough to stand in. Bookshelves lined an entire wall filled with books. I recognized books Evelyn and I had collected over the years. The furniture was simple, comfortable, designed to be lived in, not just looked at. Beyond the wall of glass, a wooden deck overlooked a silent, dark lake. This was her real office, Thorn said, his voice softer now. Her think tank. Everything is self-sufficient. Solar power, a geothermal heating system, satellite internet, its own well. You could stay here for a year and never need the outside world. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the smooth, cool surfaces. A state-of-the-art kitchen, a workshop that put my own to shame, a library with a rolling ladder. It was a home, but it was also a plan written in architecture and engineering. I sat down in an armchair by the fire, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. The last part of it was the part that changed everything. I know this is a shock, Richard, but you must understand. I did not spend my final years simply waiting. I prepared. I have been tracking Dan's business dealings for a long time. His success is an illusion, a house of cards built on risky loans and over-leveraged assets. He is closer to bankruptcy than he would ever admit. My breath caught in my chest. Evelyn had known. She had seen the rot setting in long before I had. And so, my love, I prepared a lever. Through a series of holding companies, my trust has quietly acquired the majority of his commercial debt. He thinks he owes his empire to 3 different investment banks. In reality, he owes it all to me, to you. The documents are with Albright. When the time is right, you will not have to ask for what is yours. You will simply take back what was always meant to be part of our legacy. Use it to protect yourself. Use it to show him that true strength is not about what you can take, but what you can build and defend. I looked up from the page, my eyes blurring. The fire crackled in the hearth. My quiet, bookish wife, the woman I thought I knew completely, had been a silent warrior. She hadn't just left me a fortune. She had left me a sword and a shield, and from this fortress, her fortress, I would learn how to use them. I folded the letter and held it to my chest. The paper was warm from my hands, and for a moment I could almost feel Evelyn's presence in the room, a quiet strength beside me in the firelight. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow or self-pity. They were for her. For the sheer fierce power of her love, a love that had reached across death itself to build me a fortress, to hand me a sword. She had seen the storm coming when I had only seen the clouds. She had built an ark while I was still trying to patch the roof. I looked up at Thorn, who had been standing silently by the window, giving me the dignity of my own grief. My voice when I spoke was not the voice of the broken man who had been locked out of his home just hours before. It was clear and hard as iron. Dan chose his path, I said. Now I will walk Evelyn's. A look of profound relief passed over Thorn's stoic face. He gave a single sharp nod. She knew you would, sir. All the resources of this facility and of her network are at your disposal. My loyalty is to her and now to you. What are your first orders? The word felt foreign, but necessary. For years I had been taking them, bending to the whims of my son, to the demands of a life that had grown smaller around me. No more. I stood up and walked to the great glass wall overlooking the lake. The water was a sheet of black ink holding the stars in its depths. My reflection stared back at me, a stranger in a strange house. But the man in the glass was no longer lost. The grief was still there, a hollow ache where Evelyn used to be. But it was no longer the only thing. Now it had company. Resolve. I had a base of operations. I had a loyal ally. And I had a plan meticulously crafted by the woman who knew both my heart and our son's lack of one. The sentimental old man was gone. In his place stood the executor of Evelyn Vance's final, brilliant, and ruthless will, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my soul that Dan would never see me coming. I spent the next 2 days inside Sanctuary learning its rhythms. Thorn walked me through the systems, the quiet hum of the geothermal plant, the array of monitors in the control room that showed every angle of the property. I learned that my wife had not just built a house, she had built a self-contained world. While I learned, I imagined the world Dan and Brenda were living in, a world of growing annoyance, then confusion. I could picture the scene in my old house. They would have returned the next morning, expecting me to be waiting on the porch, cold and defeated, ready to sign their papers. When they found me gone, their concern would not have been for my well-being, but for their asset. An asset that had suddenly inconveniently walked off the balance sheet. I knew my son. He would have spent a day calling hospitals and police stations not out of worry, but to build a record, to create a narrative of a confused old man who had wandered away. When that failed, he would have turned to more direct methods. Thorn confirmed my suspicions on the 3rd day. A private investigator they hired had started making inquiries. A man with a cheap suit and tired eyes had been asking questions in my old neighborhood. It didn't take him long. Evelyn had been brilliant at hiding her wealth, but she hadn't made me a ghost. The PI tracked the tail number of the jet. He traced it to a holding company, and the holding company to the land purchase in Wisconsin. On the 4th day, I was in the control room, a cup of coffee in my hand, when a new alert pinged on the screen. A vehicle was approaching on the private access road. I zoomed in. Dan's sleek silver sedan. I watched it move down the gravel lane, kicking up dust. He drove too fast, a man certain of his destination. I could picture the conversation inside the car. Brenda in the passenger seat coaching him. Remember, he's confused. Be firm but loving. We're here to rescue him." They were expecting to find a quaint country cottage, a log cabin perhaps, a simple place where a simple old man had run to hide. They thought they were the cavalry arriving to take control. The camera feed from the main gate showed them pulling up. The car stopped abruptly. I watched Dan lean forward, squinting through the windshield. He wasn't looking at a cottage. He was looking at a 12-foot wall of solid stone and steel with a camera lens staring back at him like an unblinking eye. Brenda got out of this car, her expensive heels sinking into the gravel. She looked up at the gate, then back at Dan, her expression a mask of disbelief. This wasn't in their script. Dan got out, slamming his door. He strode to the intercom panel, jabbing the button with his thumb. A chime sounded in the control room. I let it ring twice before I answered. I switched my camera on. My face appeared on the high-definition screen in front of him. I made sure the background was clear, the warm wood and stone of Sanctuary's interior, the fire burning calmly in the hearth behind me. I did not look like a prisoner. I did not look confused. I looked like a man in his own home. Dad Dan's voice was strained, a mix of shock and irritation. "What is all this? Open the gate. We're here to take you home." I let a moment of silence pass. I looked directly into the camera. "Hello, Dan," I said, my voice even calm and colder than he had ever heard it. "You are not invited. You are trespassing on private property. Leave the premises immediately." He was stunned. He actually took a step back, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked at Brenda, who was staring at the screen, her own carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. This wasn't the frail, emotional father they had planned for. Then the shock gave way to rage. His face flushed a dark red. "Dad, I don't know who you have in there with you, but this isn't funny. Open this gate right now. Are you in some kind of trouble? Is someone forcing you to do this?" He was already trying to twist the narrative to make me the victim again. "The only trouble here, Dan, is you," I said. "You have 60 seconds to turn your car around before I notify the local authorities of your trespassing." "You wouldn't dare," he roared, his voice cracking. "I am your son." "My son," I said, letting the words hang in the air for a final moment, lost the right to enter my home the night he locked me out of it. Then I cut the feed. The screen in front of him went black. I watched on the silent camera as he stood there yelling at a dead screen, a king shouting orders at a castle that refused to recognize his crown. I watched from the control room as my son's car sped away, a silver bullet disappearing back into the forest. The silence that returned to Sanctuary was absolute. Thorne came to stand beside me, his gaze fixed on the monitor. "That was the opening salvo, sir," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The next will come from their lawyers." He was right. 2 days later, a courier arrived at the gate with a crisp, legal-sized envelope. Thorne retrieved it and brought it to me in the library, where I was going through Evelyn's collection of first edition history books. I slit the envelope open with a steady hand. The words inside were cold, clinical, and brutal. It was a formal notice of their intent to file a petition for emergency conservatorship. It cited my abrupt and inexplicable relocation, my isolation from family, and my susceptibility to undue influence from third parties. They had painted me as a prisoner in my own fortress, a confused old man being manipulated by my staff. My son had officially declared war. I felt a surge of hot, white anger so intense it made my hands shake. They were using my grief, my privacy, as weapons against me. They were trying to legally erase me, to turn me into a non-person, whose life and legacy could be managed by them. I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and leather calming the fire in my chest. I scanned the document into a secure file and sent it to Mr. Albright. His call came less than 10 minutes later. He didn't sound concerned. He sounded bored. "This is predictable, Richard. It's the standard first move when greed runs out of patience. They have no case and they know it. But they hope the threat alone will be enough to make you surrender." "What do we do?" I asked. "We respond with overwhelming force," Albright said, and I could almost hear him smile. "Evelyn anticipated this. She insisted you have a full psychiatric evaluation 6 months ago under the guise of a routine checkup. The report is pristine. It declares you of sound mind and fully capable of managing your own affairs. We also have decades of your financial records showing meticulous, responsible management. I will draft a response that not only refutes their claims, but also includes a petition for a restraining order against both Daniel and Brenda, citing harassment and emotional distress. We are not just defending Richard, we are pushing back." For the first time in days, I felt a solid floor beneath my feet. Evelyn, my brilliant Evelyn. She had mapped the battlefield long before the first shot was ever fired. But Dan and Brenda weren't just fighting on one front. While Albright was drafting his legal counterattack, Brenda was launching her own offensive. Thorne brought a tablet to me one evening. His face was grim. "You need to see this, sir." He showed me a series of posts on several high society blogs and social media accounts. Brenda had crafted a heart-wrenching narrative. She had posted old photographs of me with Dan as a child of our family, at Christmas of me and Evelyn, smiling on a vacation years ago. The captions were dripping with false concern. "We are so terribly worried about my father-in-law, Richard. Since my beloved mother-in-law, Evelyn, passed, he hasn't been himself. He's isolated himself in an unknown location and is under the influence of staff who are restricting our access. We just want our father back." She had created a hashtag. It was trending in small, wealthy circles in Chicago and Boston, "Save Richard Vance." I stared at the screen, a sickness rising in my throat. She was using their happy memories, our memories, as propaganda. She was turning my love for my wife and son into a public spectacle, twisting it into a story of my own weakness and their noble suffering. Each comment of sympathy for them, felt like a physical blow. "Praying for your family, Brenda. So sad when elders become vulnerable. Your father is lucky to have such a caring son." The lies were spreading, painting a picture of a world that was the exact opposite of the truth. They weren't trying to save me. They were trying to bury me. Thorne watched me, his expression unreadable. "This is designed to support their legal case," he said quietly. "They're creating a public perception that you are unstable. It's a common tactic." I knew he was right. But the cold logic didn't stop the sting. My private life, my grief had been turned into a weapon, and it was aimed directly at my heart. I looked at the smiling face of my son in one of the pictures, a younger, happier Dan, his arm around me. I remembered that day. It was his college graduation. I had never been more proud. Now that same son was telling the world I was a confused old man who needed to be saved from himself, all so he could get his hands on my money. The battle wasn't just for the inheritance anymore. It was for my name. It was for my sanity. It was for the truth of the life I had lived. I stared at the hashtag, #Save Richard Vance, until the letters blurred. My life, my name turned into a lie for public consumption. They had fired their shots in a public square, expecting me to cower in the shadows, ashamed. They thought I would break. But something inside me didn't break. It hardened. They wanted a war fought with whispers and social media posts. They didn't know that my wife had left me an arsenal. I picked up the secure satellite phone Thorne had given me. It had only 2 numbers programmed into it, his and Mr. Albright's. I called Albright. "They've taken it public," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's time to activate the leverage Evelyn left." "I agree," Albright said, his voice crisp and immediate. "I'll arrange a conference call with Andrew Bishop at Commonwealth Financial. He's on the risk management board. He will take the call." An hour later, I sat at the head of a long boardroom table inside Sanctuary. Thorne stood by the window. Albright's voice came through the speakerphone, clear and authoritative. "Andrew, thank you for making the time. I have the trustee for the Evelyn Vance estate on the line, Mr. Richard Vance. He has a statement he needs to make." A new voice, smooth and cautious, came on the line. "Mr. Vance, how can I help?" I took a breath and chose my words with the care of a man laying a foundation stone. "Mr. Bishop," I began, "as the sole trustee of the Vance estate, which, as you know, holds a significant position in your institution, I am formally expressing my grave concern. It has come to my attention that the Vance Development Group, run by my son Daniel Vance, is exhibiting signs of extreme financial instability and engaging in high-risk practices that pose a significant reputational liability to your bank." There was a silence on the other end. It was the sound of a powerful man recalculating. "What sort of instability, Mr. Vance?" Bishop finally asked. "The kind," I said, "that leads a prudent trustee to reevaluate all associations. The Vance estate cannot be connected to any enterprise that does not meet the highest ethical standards. We are beginning a full review of our portfolio, starting with our holdings in Commonwealth Financial. I trust your board will conduct its own due diligence with the same level of urgency." I didn't need to say more. I had used their language. Reputational risk, due diligence, reevaluating our holdings. It was a threat wrapped in the politest of terms. "I understand completely, Mr. Vance," Bishop said, his voice now tight with professional alarm. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. We will be initiating an immediate and thorough credit risk review of all accounts associated with the Vance Development Group. All current lines of credit will be frozen pending the outcome of that review." When the call ended, the room was silent. The first domino had just fallen. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a single threat. I had simply used the power my wife had so carefully, so secretly placed in my hands. The money my son was counting on to fuel his war against me was now being choked off at the source. And he would have no idea it was me who had just tightened the noose. The freeze on Dan's credit was a silent, invisible move. He wouldn't feel its effects immediately. It would be a slow strangulation, a tightening in the flow of capital that would leave him confused and gasping for air. But it was only the first part of the plan Evelyn had laid out. The second part was about dismantling the facade. My son and his wife had built their lives on a foundation of lies, and I was about to expose the cracks to the world. The next morning, I made another call from the secure line, this time to Kensington Advisory Group, a firm in Chicago that specialized in forensic accounting. They were discreet, they were expensive, and they were the best. I met with a senior partner, a woman named Ms. DeLuca, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to the bottom line. I didn't tell her the whole story. I didn't need to. I simply told her I was the trustee of an estate with concerns about potential fraud at a company called Vance Development Group. I gave her the preliminary research. Evelyn had compiled a neat file of corporate filings and unusual expenditures. Ms. DeLuca looked it over, her expression unchanging. "We will find what's there, Mr. Vance," she said. "And what isn't." They were faster than I could have imagined. 4 days later, a secure encrypted file appeared in my inbox. It was a 100-page report, detailing the inner workings of my son's financial life. It was a masterpiece of deceit. They had discovered two primary shell companies. The first was an LLC called BV Interiors, registered to Brenda. For the past 3 years, Dan's company had paid this entity millions in consulting fees. The report traced that money to the purchase of 2 luxury cars, a series of first-class trips to Europe, and a river of charges from high-end designer boutiques. It was Brenda's personal slush fund, financed by the company Dan was driving into the ground. The second company was called Oakwood Holdings. This entity had been used to purchase a multi-million-dollar condominium in a glass tower on the Chicago waterfront. It was their second home, a place they never mentioned to me paid for, with funds siphoned directly from corporate accounts under the guise of asset acquisition. It was brazen, arrogant, and meticulously documented. They had grown so confident in my passivity and my ignorance that they hadn't even bothered to cover their tracks well. I sat there in the quiet of the library at Sanctuary, the damning evidence glowing on the screen. I could have sent this report to Dan. I could have used it as a threat, a bargaining chip to force him to back down. But that was the old me. That was the father who still believed a conversation could fix a problem of character. Evelyn's plan was colder and far more effective. I didn't call my son. I didn't call his lawyer. Instead, I printed the entire report. I placed the 100 pages into a large, plain manila envelope. I typed a short, single-page note on a separate sheet of paper. It read, "I was told you are a journalist who believes that the truth is in the numbers. Here are some numbers. I think you will find the story they tell is about the Vance Development Group. A source." I sealed the envelope without a return address. Thorne arranged for a bonded courier, a man who asked no questions, and left no trail to deliver it to the Chicago offices of the Tribune. It was addressed to a woman named Sarah Jenkins, an investigative reporter, with a reputation for dismantling corporate empires and a Pulitzer Prize to prove it. I watched the courier's car disappear down the private lane on the security feed. I had just anonymously delivered a financial bomb to the doorstep of the most feared journalist in the city. This wasn't revenge. It was an audit. A final, painful accounting of a debt my son had incurred against our family's name, against his mother's memory. And the bill was about to come due in the one place he couldn't control it, the public record. While the financial bomb I had sent to the Tribune was ticking, Brenda escalated her campaign of lies. It wasn't enough to paint me as a confused victim online. She needed to monetize her fake compassion. One morning, Thorne showed me a newly launched website. It was glossy, professional, and sickening. The Vance Family Foundation for Elder Care. The homepage featured a soft focus photo of Brenda holding the hand of an elderly woman who was not, of course, related to any of us. The mission statement was a masterpiece of corporate speak and false sentiment. It talked about honoring Evelyn's legacy of care and ensuring that vulnerable seniors like Richard Vance receive the support and dignity they deserve. At the bottom of the page was a large, prominent "Donate Now" button. She was using my name, my wife's memory, to solicit money from strangers, all while her husband was trying to steal my entire fortune. It was a new level of shamelessness. I looked at the picture of Brenda, her face a perfect mask of concern, and I felt a cold, clear certainty. She had chosen the battlefield. She wanted to fight over the meaning of my wife's legacy. I would give her a fight she could never win. I called Albright. "Brenda has started a fake charity in our name." Albright was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Evelyn thought she might. There is a file for this contingency as well. It's labeled Legacy." The plan was simple, elegant, and devastating. Albright spent the next 24 hours on the phone with state and federal regulators. He filed the paperwork to officially incorporate The Evelyn and Richard Vance Foundation. It was a real legal and binding entity. Then he drafted a press release. There would be no flashy website, no tearful social media posts. Just a quiet, formal announcement sent to every major news outlet in Illinois and Wisconsin. The press release went out the following morning. It announced the formation of the Evelyn and Richard Vance Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting elder care services. It also announced the foundation's inaugural act, an immediate $5 million grant to be distributed among 3 of the most respected, long-standing nursing home and assisted living networks in the state. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic for Brenda. Her phantom foundation was completely eclipsed by the real one. The news wasn't about a family squabble anymore. It was about a grieving husband making a massive, genuine philanthropic gesture in his wife's name. The narrative flipped in a matter of hours. The same blogs that had been breathlessly sharing Brenda's posts were now running headlines about my $5 million donation. The comments sections became a bloodbath. Wait. So the son is trying to get his dad's money while the dad is giving millions to charity? Is that #Save Richard Vance thing a scam? Brenda's website was flooded with angry questions. By evening, the donate button was gone. By the next morning, the entire site had been taken down. She had tried to steal my wife's name and use it as a shield for her greed. But I had reclaimed it. I had taken the name Vance and tied it not to a petty family drama, but to a powerful, undeniable act of good. Evelyn's legacy was not a hashtag or a donation button. It was a force for genuine kindness, and I was now its steward. Brenda had wanted to fight on the terrain of public perception. She just didn't realize that on that terrain the truth backed by $5 million was an unbeatable weapon. The world my son and his wife had built was a hollow structure, and I had just kicked out the 2 pillars holding it up, money and reputation. The collapse came faster than even I had anticipated. Thorne and Albright kept me updated from Sanctuary's quiet command center. The first reports were financial. The credit freeze from Commonwealth Financial had been a fatal blow. Other lenders, smelling blood in the water, began calling in their own loans. Investors who had been courting Dan for a new downtown project suddenly went silent, their calls going unanswered. His river of easy money had dried up into a cracked and barren riverbed. Brenda's social world imploded alongside it. The charity boards she sat on suddenly found reasons to restructure. The friends she lunched with were now perpetually busy. Her carefully curated image of the compassionate socialite had been shattered, replaced by the ugly reality of a cynical grifter. Her #Save Richard Vance had become a subject of mockery and online ridicule. Then Sarah Jenkins's first article appeared in the Tribune. It was a masterpiece of journalistic precision. She didn't print the salacious details from the report I'd sent. Not yet. Instead, she wrote a piece that raised serious questions about the accounting practices and financial solvency of the Vance Development Group. She quoted anonymous sources from within the Chicago real estate scene expressing growing concerns. She mentioned shell corporations and a pattern of high-risk borrowing. The article didn't accuse Dan of a crime. It did something worse. It painted him as a reckless and incompetent businessman, a fool who had built an empire out of smoke and mirrors. For a man like my son, a man whose entire identity was built on the perception of success, it was a fate worse than bankruptcy. He was a joke. He was losing control of everything he had sacrificed his family for. I knew he was cornered. I knew he was dangerous. A cornered animal doesn't reason. It lunges. I waited for the final desperate attack. It came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. A local sheriff's deputy arrived at the gate of Sanctuary to serve me with a summons. Dan had done it. He had officially filed a lawsuit petitioning the state of Wisconsin to have me declared mentally incompetent and to have himself appointed as the sole guardian and conservator of my estate. I read the document in the library, the legal language a thicket of thorns. It accused me of suffering from delusions, of being a danger to myself and my financial well-being, of having squandered a family legacy on a whim. It was a declaration of total war, a desperate final attempt to burn down my credibility, my sanity, my very identity in a court of law. But as I read the vicious lies, the frantic accusations, I felt no fear. The man who would have been shattered by this was gone, left behind on a cold porch in Chicago. I looked up at Thorne, who was watching my face. "He's done it," I said. "Yes, sir," Thorne replied. "He has. He thinks this is his final move," I said, folding the document neatly and placing it on the desk. "He thinks this is the end of the game." I walked to the window and looked out at the calm, dark waters of the lake. My wife had called this place sanctuary, a place of safety, a place to weather a storm. She knew this day would come. Dan had just chosen the battlefield where he would be defeated. "Tell Albright to accept the summons," I said, my voice steady. "Tell him we will see my son in court." The courtroom was a cold, quiet box of polished wood and muted light. It smelled of floor wax and old paper, the scent of institutional gravity. The gallery was already half full with the press, their faces a mixture of professional boredom and predatory alertness. They were here for a story of family drama and fallen fortunes, a spectacle. They didn't know they were here to witness a final accounting, a debt being called due. I watched from a small antechamber as Dan and Brenda arrived. They moved through the crowd like actors taking a stage. Dan was in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, his jaw set, trying to project an aura of a man wronged but resolute. Brenda was at his side, a vision of somber elegance in a charcoal dress, a single strand of pearls at her throat. She would occasionally touch his arm, a perfect performance of the supportive wife standing by her husband in his hour of need. They were radiating confidence, but it was a brittle, fragile thing. It was the confidence of people who had rehearsed their lines so many times, they had started to believe them. Then Mr. Albright touched my elbow. "It's time, Richard." I walked through the double doors into the courtroom. Marcus Thorne was at my other side. I was no longer the frail, submissive schoolteacher they had tried to portray. I wore a simple navy suit, one Evelyn had picked out for me years ago. It fit. I stood straighter than I had in years. We didn't walk to the gallery. We walked to the plaintiff's table and took our seats. A quiet murmur went through the room. My son had sued me, but I was not sitting in the defendant's chair. I was meeting him on equal ground. I saw Dan's eyes find me. His performative confidence faltered for just a second. He saw not the confused father he had described in his legal filings, but a man he did not recognize, a man who was calm, a man who was ready. Brenda's smile tightened at the corners, a small, almost imperceptible crack in her perfect mask. I didn't look at them again. My focus was on the judge's empty bench on the state seal carved into the wood behind it. I thought of Evelyn. I thought of her letter, her fierce love, her brilliant strategic mind. I was not here for revenge. I was here to honor her, to finish the work she had started. I was here to protect the truth. The bailiff's voice boomed through the room. "All rise." The shuffling of feet, the creak of wooden benches. The judge entered, a woman with graying hair and a face that promised no patience for theatrics. She took her seat. The gavel fell with a sharp, clean crack, and the room fell silent. The performance was over. The reckoning had begun. Dan's lawyer was smooth, a man paid to make ugly things sound reasonable. He moved with a practiced ease, presenting his case to the judge. He projected emails onto a large screen for the court to see messages from Dan to me, all sent after Evelyn's death. "Just checking in, Dad. Hope you're doing okay. Let me know if you need anything at all." The words were hollow, but in the sterile light of the courtroom, they looked like care. He then displayed screenshots of Brenda's social media campaign, the soft focus photos, the cloying captions about their worry and love. He spoke of my erratic behavior, my sudden isolation, and framed their lawsuit not as an act of greed, but as a painful, necessary step to protect a beloved father. It was a beautiful performance. I sat at my table, my hands resting flat on the wood, and felt nothing but the cold, hard truth of what was real. When he finished, the judge turned her gaze to our table. Mr. Albright. Albright rose slowly, a tall, steady figure. He didn't approach the judge's bench. He stood beside me. "Your Honor," he began, his voice filling the quiet room. "The plaintiff has presented a narrative of concern, a story. We are here today to present facts. Before we present the extensive medical and financial evidence of my client's sound mind and unimpeachable competence, we wish to call a special witness. A witness who can speak directly to Mr. Daniel Vance's definition of family." A ripple of curiosity went through the gallery. Dan shifted in his seat, a flicker of annoyance on his face. This was not in his script. "The defense calls Isabella Rossi to the stand," Albright announced. The heavy courtroom doors at the back of the room swung open. A woman in her early 40s, dressed in a simple, dark blue dress, walked in. She was not glamorous like Brenda, but she carried herself with a quiet, unbreakable dignity. Beside her, walking just a step behind, was a tall young man of about 19, with dark, serious eyes and a jawline that was strikingly familiar. It was Dan's jawline. I watched my son. All the color drained from his face. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. His hand, which had been resting on a stack of papers, clenched into a fist. Brenda leaned toward him, whispering, her face a mask of confusion. Who were these people? The woman took the stand, her back straight, and swore the oath. The young man sat in the front row of the gallery, his eyes fixed on Dan. Ms. Rosie Albright began gently. "Could you please tell the court your relationship to Mr. Daniel Vance?" Isabella's voice was clear and steady. "Daniel Vance is my first husband." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Brenda's head snapped toward Dan, her eyes wide with shock and fury. "We were married 20 years ago," Isabella continued, her gaze never leaving the judge. "We were young. I was a student. He was just starting out in business. He was ambitious. When I told him I was pregnant, he said it was a mistake. He said a child would be an anchor, and he was building a ship meant for speed. He gave me $500 and told me to take care of it. Then he disappeared. I haven't seen or heard from him since." Albright let the words settle. "And did he ever provide any financial support for his son?" "Never," Isabella said. "Not $1. "So you raised your son Leo on your own?" "I did not," she said, and for the first time she looked toward me, her expression softening. "I had help. From his grandmother. From Evelyn Vance." This time the sound in the courtroom was a loud, shocked murmur. Dan looked like he was going to be physically ill. Isabella turned her attention back to the judge. "About 10 years ago, Evelyn found me. She didn't come with pity or charity. She came with a quiet offer of support. She said, 'A Vance always takes care of their own, and Leo is a Vance.' She set up an educational fund. She sent birthday gifts. She called every month to check in. She did it all in secret, she told me, because she didn't want to cause her husband Richard the pain of knowing what his son had done. She was his secret grandmother. She was the only family he ever knew from that side. The room was silent, hanging on her every word. The story Brenda had so carefully crafted of a loving son and a confused father had been utterly demolished. In its place was a story of cold abandonment and the quiet, fierce loyalty of a woman who had righted her son's wrongs in secret. Albright walked back to our table. He picked up a single document from his binder. "Your Honor, this testimony is not just a matter of character. It is the foundation for the entire disposition of the Vance estate." He approached the clerk and handed her the document. "This is an amendment to the Evelyn Vance Trust, signed and notarized 1 year prior to her death." He projected the document onto the screen. I saw Evelyn's signature at the bottom, strong and clear. "I would like to read the final clause of this amendment for the court." Albright said, his voice ringing with finality. He read slowly, letting each word land like a hammer blow. "In the event that my husband Richard Vance is deceased, or is for any reason declared legally incapacitated, the role of successor trustee and the status of sole beneficiary of this trust shall not pass to my son Daniel Vance. Instead, all rights, titles, and assets of the Vance Trust will pass immediately and irrevocably to my grandson Leo Rossi Vance." It was over. Dan stared at the screen, his face a hollow mask of disbelief. Brenda wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the young man in the front row, the boy who had just inherited the $48 million fortune she had schemed and fought and lied for. Her face was a terrifying mixture of fury and despair. Dan had lost. He hadn't just lost a lawsuit. He had lost his past, his present, and his future in a single devastating moment. The son he had abandoned was now the heir to the empire he had tried to steal. Evelyn's final move wasn't just a legal strategy. It was justice. The judge's gavel came down with a sound that felt like the cracking of a dam. "This petition," she declared, her voice sharp with contempt, "is dismissed with prejudice." It was over. Dan sat slumped in his chair, a broken man stripped of his lies in a public forum. Brenda stared at him, not with sympathy, but with pure, unadulterated fury. The future she had been so sure of had evaporated before her eyes. Their lawyer was already packing his briefcase, avoiding their gaze. As they were escorted out, they walked through a gauntlet of reporters, the flash of cameras like small, merciless explosions. Dan's empty, shell-shocked face was the last thing I saw before the doors swung shut. I didn't watch them go. I turned to the front of the gallery, to the woman with the quiet, dignified face and the young man with my wife's eyes. Leo and Isabella. I walked toward them, and the crowd of reporters and spectators seemed to melt away. When I reached them, I didn't say anything. I just opened my arms, and for the first time I hugged my grandson. I felt his shoulders tense, then relax into the embrace. I didn't feel the thrill of victory. I felt the quiet, steady click of a missing piece of my life finally sliding into place. I had not only protected my wife's legacy, I had found it. The final scene of our war was not in a courtroom, but on the deck of Sanctuary a few days later. The three of us stood together, Isabella, Leo, and I, looking out at the vast, silent forest. The air was clean, and the only sound was the wind in the pines. I took out the thick, creamy envelope from my jacket pocket, the one Evelyn had written to me. I had read it a dozen times. Now it was time to pass it on. I handed the letter to Leo. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "She saw the best in people, and she prepared for the worst. She wanted you to have this. She wanted you to know that you were never forgotten, that you were loved. He took the letter, his young hands holding it with a reverence that made my heart ache. He looked from the letter to me, and in his eyes I saw the future. Evelyn's real legacy wasn't the $48 million. It was this, the continuation of love, the mending of a broken line, the sacred duty of family. Standing there between the family I had lost and the family I had found, I was finally at peace. Never mistake quietness for weakness. While greed makes loud demands true, power lies in silent preparation and documented facts. A well-executed plan built on foresight ensures that justice, not entitlement, will ultimately have the final, undeniable say. If this story of justice and foresight resonated with you, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more.